Hey Ecofictologists, my name is Lovis and today I'm bringing you a book review of Clade by James Bradley. This book is so interesting and the storytelling format is unique. I had a really good time reading this. I don't know if I would describe it as feel-good, but it was incredibly thought-provoking and emotional. It brings the topic of climate change directly to your doorstep, no matter where you might be living. So make sure you're comfortable and let's get into it. A spoiler-free summary of this book. Clade is told over a number of generations and from several characters' points of view. As the family grows, so does the climate crisis. When the story starts, we are in Adam's head, who until now has still been trying to find hope in the situation, trusting politicians and business leaders to find a solution. But his research trip to the Arctic quickly puts him face to face with the reality of what we have put in motion. As we follow him and his progeny throughout this story, we encounter the effects of climate change that are just impossible to ignore. If I tell you what they are, I think that counts as spoilers, so I won't, but I will tell you that they're so plausible that actually you can see some of them already happening now. Maybe not exactly in the neighborhood where you live, but if you widen your scope a little bit, you will see the evidence of it. James Bradley also weaves in smaller changes into everyday conversation, not the big, catastrophic, human life-threatening events, but the slow changes, where you don't really notice that something is changing until it's gone, like the birds that used to sing around the beach house, or coffee, where crop failure made it so pricey that it became unaffordable. Or the fish and chip shop around the corner that had to close because the catch is so low and the prices are so high. If you're from the UK, that might seem catastrophic to you. But he also relates all of these changes back to the human experience. He talks about climate change refugees and how soon nobody will be safe from the effects, no matter where you live. Oh, and this all happens in the next century or so. There's a distinct sense of grief and loss in this book, as characters reflect about what used to be around that isn't around anymore. And Bradley says that this is very deliberate because you can't talk about climate change without talking about loss. The title Clade is a scientific term for a group of organisms that share a common ancestor. And the book spans several decades, and we switch perspectives from character to character, spreading from where the story originates. So you can see how the title relates to the structure of the story, all of these characters interconnecting, but they all share one commonality, which is Adam. Reading this book was both fascinating and terrifying. I recognize some of these places in this book. I've been there or I've lived there, and to imagine these changes happening is heartbreaking. And you don't really have to have a very strong imagination because James Bradley makes everything seem so real. In an interview he gave, he said he was very careful about not writing an apocalyptic or a dystopian story, but that the book can act as a cautionary tale. You know, one of the many possible futures that we might encounter, and to make us think, do we really want this to be the world that our children have to live through? The book is very much about family and how the world will be changing as children grow up over the coming decades. Between writing the book before and Clade, James Bradley became a father, and he says that he does worry about the state of the world and what world he is giving to his children. He said he wanted to write a book that says, yes, there are many problems that we will have to face in the future, but the future is also not set. We do control it to some extent. Forecasting into the future, the further you go, obviously the possibilities just multiply. And whether you think the world is going in the direction that he chose or not, you cannot deny that things will change, our way of life will change, and the experiences that shape society will be different, and we will have to adapt. Climate change is obviously a huge part of this plot, and it drives a lot of the character interactions, but it also acts as a backdrop for telling other storylines on family dynamics, mental health, romance, autism, and many other things. Even though the story often jumps ahead to a new decade or a new generation, and it often switches character perspectives, you still care very much about the fate of the characters, because James Bradley makes them feel so human and so relatable. It also gives the reader this connection between the everyday lives of the characters and this bigger story that is climate change. Bradley said in an interview with Mary Woodbury at Dragonfly.eco that telling the story from the point of view of a family gives the reader a prism through which to view topics like climate change and anthropogenic impact, which otherwise might feel too big to think about as a whole. In fact, he says this is one of the advantages of fiction. In his opinion, it's very important to talk about these topics, but at the moment it's still a bit socially awkward because it's depressing, and you end up looking a bit like a lunatic, his words. But fiction provides a framework and a language for people to start this conversation and maybe dissect like a small portion of this hyper-object that is climate change. Something that struck me about the events in Clade was that there was very little mention of us actually changing our behaviours to combat climate change. Things just got worse and worse, and eventually we will have to deal with the consequences, both the human and the ecological ones. The book offers no suggestion of alternatives. Maybe it's because it's such a fast-moving wave that any efforts we made were too little too late, or maybe Bradley really wanted to show what would happen if we continue to do nothing. There's one passage I want to read to you that really stuck with me. It's very short, but I think it's very relevant. A bit of context: Adam and his wife Ellie are trying to have a baby, and he is grappling with the moral dilemma of whether it's morally wrong to do so. He could not get the equations he had scribbled down out of his head, could not let go of the fact that bringing one more mouth into the world was merely adding to a problem that was already out of control. One of his colleagues sometimes talked about the deep structures of intelligence, the way in which human brains had been shaped by evolution. We don't change because we don't believe in the problem, he would say, at least not at the deep, intuitive level that we need to. We can see it when it's in front of us, see what it means. We know we have to change. But as soon as we're away from it, our old thinking reasserts itself, our desire to reproduce, to build power. Out of sight, out of mind is very powerful, and I think it's one of the big reasons behind our reluctance to change. When asked about why he wrote this book, James Bradley said he wanted to give people an effective language to think about climate change, and he wanted to give them a narrative where they might understand what it will feel like to live through the coming decades. Readers who might not have completely come to grips with the scale and the scope of the climate change reality might be able to use this framework to start thinking about the problem, and ecofiction books can provide a space where they can make the idea of change more tangible. So that's it from me, Ecofictologists. I hope you've enjoyed this review of Clade by James Bradley, and if you have, then click that like button, and if you want more content like this, then while you're at it, click that subscribe button too, and hit the bell, and then you'll get notified every time I post something new. That bell will go off every Wednesday. James Bradley also has a new book out called Ghost Species, which I am so excited to read. The title just gives me all kinds of shivers and puts pictures in my head of what I can expect from the book. And from how much I enjoyed Clade, I know I'm going to love Ghost Species too, which also falls into the ecofiction genre. So go out and read James Bradley. I'll see you next week, Ecofictologists. Go read something.